Window seat on the evening flight. Armrests didn't do much, and neither did we. The airport bustled with the familiar chaos of evening departures. You know that peculiar energy that fills terminal buildings as day shifts to night? The fluorescent lights seem harsher somehow, reflecting off polished floors where hurried travelers pull rolling suitcases that echo through the vast spaces. Gate agents make final boarding announcements, their voices carrying that particular blend of authority and exhaustion that comes from repeating the same phrases hundreds of times each day. I've always found something oddly comforting about airports at dusk. They exist as these liminal spaces between responsibilities, between the life you're temporarily leaving and whatever awaits at your destination. I stood in line at gate C-17, boarding pass clutched perhaps too tightly in my hand, watching fellow passengers shuffle forward in that peculiar dance of impatience and resignation. Business travelers in wrinkled suits checked emails one last time before the enforced digital silence of takeoff. Families corralled overtired children whose excitement about flying had long since transformed into cranky exhaustion. College students with overstuffed backpacks and noise-canceling headphones already positioned to create their own private soundscapes for the journey ahead. My destination was Seattle, a business trip that had been scheduled, rescheduled, and finally confirmed just days earlier. I work in architectural consulting, which means I spend more time than I'd like in airports and hotel rooms, examining buildings in various states of completion or disrepair. There's something ironic about spending so much time in transit spaces when your job involves analyzing the permanence of structures. Let me explain why this matters. We often think of buildings as fixed, immovable parts of our landscape, but when you spend your life in motion, you begin to see how even the most solid structures are temporary in their own way, changing with use, with weather, with time. When my zone was finally called, I joined the shuffling procession down the jet bridge, that strange in-between space that always smells faintly of jet fuel and recycled air. The flight attendant greeted me with the practiced smile of someone 8 hours into their shift, and I made my way down the narrow aisle to seat 14A, window seat, as I always request. There's something about pressing my shoulder against the curve of an airplane's hull that grounds me, despite being 30,000 feet in the air. As I settled in, arranging my small backpack under the seat in front of me, I glanced at my row companions arriving. The middle seat was claimed by a woman perhaps in her 60s, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She nodded politely as she sat down, immediately retrieving a paperback mystery from her bag. The cover showed a shadowy figure and bold typography, promising twists and revelations. The aisle seat remained empty until final boarding, when a young man in his 20s, breathless from what I assumed was a sprint through the terminal, dropped into it with a relieved sigh. "Made it," he said to no one in particular, though both the woman and I offered small smiles of acknowledgement. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming us aboard and promising a smooth flight to Seattle, just under 4 hours gate to gate. Outside my window, the last rays of sunlight painted the tarmac in golden hues. Ground crew in neon vests moved with practiced efficiency, their gestures illuminated in the fading light. There's something magical about that moment when day transitions to evening, especially when viewed from an airport, the runway lights beginning to glow more prominently against the darkening sky, creating pathways of illumination that guide massive machines safely into the air. As we taxied toward the runway, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the terminal building slowly recede. The engines rumbled with increasing intensity, that familiar vibration traveling through the floor and into my bones. Then came the moment I never tire of, the sudden acceleration, the pressure pushing me back into my seat, and the delicate moment when gravity loosens its hold and the aircraft lifts into the air. The ground fell away, the city transformed into a sprawling grid of lights, and we ascended into a sky painted in watercolor shades of orange, pink, and deepening blue. The sunset from a plane window offers a perspective few other experiences can match. From the ground, we watch the sun descend to the horizon, but from altitude, you witness the earth itself seeming to rotate away from the light. The clouds below us caught the fading sunlight, transformed into mountains of gold and amber floating on a darkening sea. I've seen countless sunsets from airplane windows, yet they never lose their power to awe. Here we were, hundreds of strangers sealed in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. Yet how many were pressing their faces to the windows, witnessing this spectacular display? How many were missing it entirely, focused on in-flight entertainment or attempting to catch some sleep? The beauty outside my window stood in stark contrast to the increasingly apparent reality of economy-class seating. As the fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, my row companions and I faced the inevitable awkwardness of the armrest negotiation. The woman beside me had already claimed the shared armrest between us, her elbow firmly planted while she turned pages in her mystery novel. I didn't mind. I had the window to lean against. But I watched with mild amusement as she and the young man silently established their boundary at the other shared armrest, a choreography of subtle movements and polite retreats. These unspoken armrest negotiations fascinate me. There's no official rulebook, yet most travelers seem to understand the basic principles. Middle seat gets priority due to their lack of other comforts. Window seat has the wall to lean on. Aisle seat has freedom of movement. Yet these principles are rarely explicitly acknowledged, leading to that familiar tension where we're hyper-aware of every millimeter of encroachment into what we perceive as our territory. The flight attendants began their service, pushing the beverage cart slowly down the aisle. The cabin lights had dimmed, creating that intimate atmosphere unique to evening flights. Conversations around us hummed at a lower volume than daytime flights, as if the darkening sky outside mandated a shift to indoor voices. The woman beside me ordered a tomato juice, no ice. The young man asked for a ginger ale. I requested water, suddenly aware of how dehydrated air travel leaves me. Heading to Seattle for business or pleasure? The woman asked me as she accepted her plastic cup, breaking the silence between us. Business, I replied. I'm an architectural consultant. Building assessment for a renovation project downtown. Ah, that sounds fascinating, she said, though her tone suggested polite interest rather than genuine fascination. I'm visiting my daughter and new grandbaby. First time meeting her in person. 3 months old already. Her face softened as she mentioned her grandchild, the pride evident in her expression. She reached for her phone, and I knew what was coming. The obligatory sharing of photos. Sure enough, she swiped through several images of a round-faced infant with a surprising amount of dark hair, swaddled in various pastel-colored blankets. She's beautiful, I said, and meant it. There's something universally touching about new life, even when presented by strangers in the confined space of an airplane row. The young man, who had been quietly listening to our exchange, leaned slightly forward. I'm heading back home after a job interview, he offered. Software engineering position. Think it went well, but you know how it is, hard to tell sometimes. And just like that, our row of strangers had established the beginnings of connection. It's peculiar how the artificial environment of an airplane can sometimes facilitate conversations that wouldn't happen elsewhere. 3 people with no prior connection and likely no future interaction, sharing personal details while suspended between cities, between phases of our respective journeys. Our conversation meandered through the usual topics, weather comparisons between our home cities, travel experiences, mild complaints about airport security procedures. The armrests, I noticed, had ceased to be contentious borders and had become simply functional parts of our shared space. The woman, Margaret, she told us, had retired 2 years ago from teaching high school English. The young man, Tyler, was finishing his master's degree and hoping to launch his career in Seattle's tech industry. I shared stories about unusual architectural features I'd encountered in my work, the kinds of details most people never notice about the buildings they occupy daily. Outside my window, night had fully claimed the sky. We were flying above a scattered layer of clouds, their tops illuminated by moonlight, creating an otherworldly landscape that shifted and flowed beneath us. Occasionally, the clouds would part to reveal clusters of lights far below, small towns and highways cutting through the darkness like luminous rivers. There's something about night flying that invites introspection. Perhaps it's the darkness outside, or the hushed atmosphere within the cabin, but my mind often drifts toward contemplation when I'm seated by a window at cruising altitude after sunset. I found myself thinking about the strange temporariness of air travel relationships. how we share intimate space with strangers, sometimes engage in surprisingly personal conversations, and then part ways forever at the destination, rarely giving each other another thought. Margaret had returned to her mystery novel, occasionally turning to gaze out the window when I pointed out particularly beautiful cloud formations. Tyler had put on headphones but kept the volume low enough to remain part of our sporadic conversation. The flight attendants made another pass with the beverage cart, and the routine familiarity of air travel settled over our row. I pressed my temple against the window, watching my reflection ghosted against the darkness outside, occasionally disappearing when we passed through clouds. Below us, America was sleeping or preparing to sleep, millions of lives continuing while we transited above them at hundreds of miles per hour. There's something humbling about that perspective, how small individual concerns seem when viewed from altitude, yet how important each life is in its own sphere. The armrest between us hadn't done much to provide real comfort or meaningful separation. They're such inadequate devices, really narrow, hard, and inevitably contested territory. Yet they serve as physical manifestations of the boundaries we maintain even in close proximity. And we, the passengers in row 14, hadn't done much either. Just exchanged pleasantries and brief life summaries before retreating back into our private worlds. But isn't that the nature of most human connections? Brief intersections of separate journeys, moments of shared experience before paths diverge again. As the flight progressed, I noticed how the cabin had quieted. Many passengers were sleeping or watching movies with headphones, small screens illuminating faces in the dimness. Flight attendants moved through the aisles less frequently, checking seatbelts and responding to occasional call buttons. There's a particular kind of solitude available on night flights, surrounded by people, yet enveloped in a bubble of privacy created by darkness and the white noise of engines. I must have dozed off at some point, because I awakened to the captain's voice announcing our initial descent into Seattle. Outside, the blackness had given way to scattered lights below, growing more numerous as we approached the city. Margaret was still awake, her book nearly finished judging by the few pages remaining. Tyler was gazing out toward my window, and I shifted slightly to give him a better view as the Seattle skyline came into view, the Space Needle illuminated against the night sky. "Beautiful city," Margaret commented. "My daughter moved there 3 years ago. Says the rain isn't as bad as everyone claims. It's the gray that gets to you more than the actual rainfall," Tyler replied. "But spring and summer make up for the winter months." I watched as the plane's shadow, cast by the city lights below, raced across the landscape as we descended. There's something poetic about that moment of return to Earth, the transition from being above the world to rejoining it, from being observers to participants once again. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thunk that vibrated through the cabin floor, and the flaps adjusted with hydraulic precision, slowing our approach. The touchdown was smooth, just a slight bump as the wheels met the runway, followed by the roar of engines reversing thrust to slow our momentum. As we taxied toward the gate, passengers began the familiar routine of preparing to disembark, powering on phones, gathering belongings, stretching cramped limbs. The artificial community of our flight was already dissolving, each person mentally transitioning to whatever awaited them in Seattle. "Well," Margaret said, closing her book and tucking it into her bag, "it was lovely chatting with you both. Good luck with your building assessment. And congratulations again on your granddaughter," I replied. "Enjoy your time with her." Tyler nodded to both of us. "Thanks for the company. And hey, good luck with the job," I added. "Appreciate it," he said with a smile. As we filed into the aisle and slowly made our way toward the exit, I realized I didn't know these people's last names. We had shared a confined space for nearly 4 hours, exchanged personal stories, and yet remained fundamentally strangers to one another. There's something uniquely modern about that experience, the temporary intimacy of travel that evaporates upon arrival. Stepping into the jet bridge, I felt the cool, damp Seattle air seeping through the seams. Ahead, Margaret was already moving with purpose toward the terminal, likely eager to meet her daughter and granddaughter. Tyler had fallen behind, answering a phone call. Our brief community had already dispersed, our shared experience of flight already transforming into memory. As I walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, I reflected on how the window seat had offered me both isolation and connection, the private view of clouds and sunset, yet also a conversation starter with my row companions. The armrests hadn't done much to provide real comfort or establish meaningful boundaries. And we, the temporary inhabitants of row 14, hadn't done much either in the grand scheme of things, just passed a few hours together in a metal tube traversing the country. But perhaps that's enough. Perhaps these fleeting connections, these momentary communities formed and dissolved in transit, serve their own purpose in our increasingly isolated modern lives. We share armrests and brief conversations, glimpses into lives that intersect with ours for mere hours before continuing on their separate trajectories. We witness the same sunset from the same altitude, even if we interpret its beauty differently through the lenses of our individual experiences. Tomorrow, I would be examining building foundations and structural integrity, concerned with permanence and stability. But tonight, I had been reminded of the value of impermanence, the beauty of connections that form without expectation of longevity, the shared humanity found in the simple acknowledgement of fellow travelers on their own journeys. Outside the airport, the Seattle night welcomed me with its distinctive scent of evergreens and salt water. A new city, a new temporary home, new strangers to encounter. The flight was already fading into memory, just another evening spent in transit between destinations. The window seat would be occupied by someone else tomorrow, the armrests contested in the same silent negotiations, the conversations between strangers following similar patterns of cautious connection. And yet, something about this particular flight would stay with me. Not because anything extraordinary had happened, but perhaps because I had been present enough to notice the ordinary miracle of human connection, however brief, however bounded by the artificial constraints of air travel. The armrests didn't do much, and neither did we, except remind each other, in small ways, that we're all just passing through, seeking moments of beauty and connection on our respective journeys through the clouds. Total _char_count, 13,867.